Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for coming out. I had the pleasure of listening to Bob. He said that taxes are going up and spending is not going down. That's pretty much what I had to say. So I suggest we take an hour break to make phone calls and head to the breakouts. What do you say? Well, since you're stuck here, let me talk a little bit more about what is happening in Washington right now. It is actually a very good time to be talking about this, because if we look over the last 6 or 7 weeks, a lot has happened. First of all, we have seen health care reform pass, and we have seen a jobs bill, additional stimulus legislation pass. And now we are on the verge, I believe, of seeing financial services reform pass. A vote's going to probably come in the Senate this week. And now Congress is going to turn its attention to a number of very significant tax changes that I think are going to affect you and your clients. You know, I look over this list, all of which involve taxes. I'm reminded of the saying we all know that nothing is inevitable other than death and taxes. And when I look at this list, I think, you know, the difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. But taxes do, and so that's what I want to talk through with you as far as what's going to happen this year. And again, as I always do, it is not so much do we agree or disagree with what's happening in Washington, but how do we position client assets, give clients advice in the legislative environment that we currently have. Let's start with health care reform. Very controversial measure, passed in a very controversial way. What is in this health care reform law that is now the law of the land? The health care reform law has 5 basic elements. The first element is what we call an employer mandate. Every employer has to provide comprehensive insurance to every employee or pay a special tax to the government. We call this pay or play because every business has to choose. It either pays the tax or it plays. It provides health care to its employees. There's an exception for small businesses, defined as businesses with fewer than 50 employees. They don't have to pay or play. Every other business does. The second element is an individual mandate. Every single American must have health insurance. And if you don't get it from your employer or under Medicare, you must obtain it on your own. There is no opting out of insurance anymore in the United States under this law. It is this provision that a number of states and others are challenging as unconstitutional. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The third element says that when you apply for your insurance, you will get it. You can't be denied coverage based on the state of your health, based on pre-existing conditions. You will get your insurance. And we will give you another option. If you don't want to buy your insurance from the private companies that sell it, you can buy your insurance from a new government-administered, government-sponsored insurance program. Now, this is not the full-fledged so-called public option that we heard about last year where the federal government would sell insurance. This is a compromise provision where the federal government will administer a program but hire 2 private companies to do the selling. I'll let you decide if that's a meaningful difference. It was enough to get this through the Senate. And then finally, fifth element, we will help people. If your family's income is under $88,000 a year, you will get a subsidy to buy your insurance. And if it's under $30,000, you will get it for free. Those are the 5 elements of the health care reform law. Now, I mentioned that one of those elements is being challenged as unconstitutional, the requirement that every American have insurance. A number of states and individuals are saying that Congress does not have the power to force private citizens to enter into contracts with private companies. And that's not a frivolous argument. That's a meaningful argument. Those challengers will have something to say in court. But on balance, my gut reaction is that those challenges are likely to lose. And the reason is that Congress is not forcing people to buy insurance. They are not throwing you in jail if you don't have insurance. That might be unconstitutional. What Congress is doing is levying a tax on people who fail to have insurance. And Congress's authority to tax has pretty much been upheld as plenary. They can do what they want in this area. And I think if you cast this as a tax provision rather than a contract provision, it probably, not certainly, but probably passes constitutional scrutiny. But let's say I'm wrong. Let's say the states are correct, that this is unconstitutional. I'm not sure where they're going with these lawsuits, because the requirement that everybody have insurance is the quid pro quo for the requirement that when you apply for your insurance, you will get it, regardless of any pre-existing conditions. If you take away the requirement that everybody have insurance, Then we all wait until we're sick, and then we go to the insurance company and we say, okay, cover me now, you have to do it. Well, that's obviously untenable. That either brings down the insurance companies or we have to relieve them of that obligation. Well, then who covers all the sick people in the United States? The federal government. And so you end up with the so-called single-payer system where the federal government controls all health care that opponents of this legislation really detested, much worse than they detested what we finally ended up with. So my concern is that by prosecuting these suits, the states could end up in a position worse than where we have ended up so far. We'll see what happens, but that is my concern. All right, there is obviously controversy around each of those 5 elements, as I mentioned. But that's not the real controversy of this legislation. The real controversy is, how are we going to pay for this? Health care reform is going to cost about $1 trillion over 10 years. Now, half of that is to be paid for by reducing Medicare outlays, forcing doctors and hospitals and drug companies to take less money under the Medicare program. But the other half is to be paid for with tax increases. And in the final legislation, there is a new tax increase inserted that I think has not gotten the attention it deserves. Under the legislation as passed, there is a new 3.8% tax imposed on taxable investment income received by families whose overall income is above $250,000 a year. So if your family's income is over $250,000, your taxable investment income, interest, dividends, capital gains, will all be subject to an additional 3.8% tax. Now, this tax will not apply to investment income that is not taxable. It will not apply, for instance, to tax-exempt municipal bond interest. And it will not apply to money taken out of qualified retirement plans, 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs. But otherwise, your investment income will now be taxed, or will soon be taxed, at an additional 3.8%. In addition, your wage income, your compensation income, income from your business will be subject to an additional tax, in this case 0.9%, about 1%, again, only for families with income above $250,000 a year. Both of these new taxes begin in 2013, about 3 years from now. So again, to sum up, beginning 3 years from now, if your family's income is over $250,000, your taxable investment income will be subject to an additional 3.8% tax, and your wage and compensation and business income will be subject to an additional 0.9% tax. These are not proposals, these are law. These have been passed by the health care reform law. Now, I said we'd also see a jobs bill, additional stimulus money, an effort to drive down the unemployment rate before the November election, something of great importance to the Democrats. Now, the jobs bill has been passed, and a significant amount of the money this year will be spent on infrastructure improvements, repairing roads and bridges and schools, and hiring people to do that. Now, last year we had a major stimulus package, $800 billion. A significant portion of last year's money also goes to infrastructure improvements, and more than half of last year's money has not yet been spent. You know, I drive all over the United States, and next to a number of roads, I've seen these new green signs pop up saying the road is going to be repaired under the American Recovery and Rehabilitation Act. That's last year's stimulus act. I'm sure you've seen those signs. What always amazes me every time I see those signs is there's no road work going on next to those signs. This has led me to believe that we're working our way through the recession by setting up signs all over the United States. But the fact is actually that that money hasn't flowed. It is just starting to flow. We're going to see a lot of money coming into the economy under last year's stimulus legislation. Now we have additional money under this year's Jobs Act. Now, the jobs bill as passed also has two important incentives for small businesses. So those of you who have clients who run their own businesses will want to be aware of these. First, small businesses this year can hire unemployed workers and get a tax credit for doing so. Second, and more important, because I believe the savings are greater, small businesses this year can spend up to $250,000 on capital assets and write off everything they spend immediately. So this is the year to talk to your business clients about buying the new computers, the office equipment, the furniture. They can deduct everything they spend this year up to $250,000. Again, that is not a proposal. That is law under the Jobs Act. Now, I said that we would see financial services regulation finally. Here we are 18 months after the meltdown in the financial markets. Congress has still been unable to pass financial services reform. Now, this effort got a boost a little while ago when Senator Dodd gave his version of financial services reform, which is the blueprint for what is going forward. It got a second boost when the White House got very strongly behind obtaining reform. They say now it is their top priority now that health care has been passed, and this is something they want passed as well. Why did the White House do that? Well, perversely, it comes out of the election of Senator Brown in Massachusetts, the Republican who got Ted Kennedy's seat back in January. Senator Brown ran on a platform of saying that the administration does not feel the rage that the average American feels about the bailout of the financial services industry. And that convinced Obama that he was going to have to get on board there and start explaining that he, too, is angry about this bailout. This reminds me of the gentleman during the French Revolution who said, "There go the people. I am their leader. I must follow them." In any event, the White House is now on board, and they are assiduously reaching across the aisle in an effort to try to get financial services reform passed. And I believe they are being successful and that we finally are going to see this passed. And the legislation would do what you would expect. It will impose higher capital requirements on large financial institutions. It will require some institutions to divest themselves of particularly risky operations. We are going to see derivatives regulated in hedge funds and credit rating agencies. We already have a new law regulating credit cards. But the one aspect of this I want to point out to you is the last bullet up here, and that is the Dodd bill would require the SEC to consider whether financial advisors should be held to the same regulatory standards as investment advisors. This is legislative speak for should you be held to a fiduciary standard. Right now, you are subject to a suitability standard. The product you sell has to be suitable for the clients. You don't sell annuities with 10-year surrender charges to somebody who's 95 years old. But a fiduciary standard is a higher standard. Think of a trustee who has to remove itself from the equation in deciding what to buy for a trust. Now, the SEC is going to be looking at this and issuing a report in the coming months, but we already have some feel for what they're thinking. The chairman of the SEC says, "I'm not sure what standard should be applied, but I think there needs to be more disclosure at the point of sale. Disclosure of a financial advisor's actual compensation when they sell a product, and where the financial advisor makes more on a particular product than they might otherwise, why that product is nonetheless in the interests of the client." So where you see an apparent conflict of interest, explaining to the client why it is okay. In addition, says the chairman of the SEC, I have some concerns about 12b-1 fees. 12b-1 fees were initially intended to permit mutual funds to promote themselves, to bring in a critical mass of money. If that's the reason for 12b-1 fees, says the chairman of the SEC, why do we allow mutual funds that are closed to new business continue to charge 12b-1 fees? Something is wrong here. And so she says she wants to reform 12b-1 fees. If that changes, look for it to have an effect on C shares, the commissions on which are typically paid out of 12b-1 fees. Doesn't mean anything you're doing now is wrong or you have to change your practice, but we may see some changes coming down the road by the time the SEC finishes their study.